The stale air in the hotel room smelled of cheap perfume and a sickness I couldn't yet name. It clung to the velvet curtains, to the patterned carpet, to the phone pressed tight against my ear. My husband's voice, a low murmur on the other end, was a knife I hadn't seen coming, hidden inside a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear.
He was talking about me.
About the divorce he was planning. About money. And the words, delivered with a casual cruelty that stopped my heart cold, were, "Don't worry about her. She'll never get a penny. I've made sure of it." There was a laugh then. A light, airy laugh that wasn't mine. Her laugh. The woman he was telling this to. And the sound was like glass shattering inside my skull. He chuckled, a self-satisfied sound that scraped against my raw nerves. She's got that little project of hers, I guess. Playing entrepreneur.
Goo.
But it's worthless. Paper dreams. When this is over, she'll have nothing. Just the clothes on her back and that ridiculous laptop. My fingers turned white against the phone. My breath hitched. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not eavesdropping. I'd come to the city for a conference, a small, hopeful step for the very project he was mocking. He'd said he had a late meeting, couldn't make dinner. I'd felt a familiar pang of disappointment, loneliness in a hotel room lit by the glow of the city outside. But something had felt off. A flicker of intuition, a cold knot in my stomach that had been growing for months. I'd called his phone to say goodnight, expecting his voicemail. Instead, he'd answered. Except he hadn't known he'd answered. It was in his pocket, the call connected by accident, the sounds of his conversation spilling into my ear like sewage. I heard him shifting, the rustle of sheets. He was in bed, with her, while telling me he was in a meeting. The double betrayal hit simultaneously, the infidelity, the calculated financial destruction he was planning. She'll never get a penny, not just divorce, but annihilation. He wanted to leave me with nothing. The phone felt heavy, a physical weight in my hand, mirroring the sudden, crushing weight on my chest. The city lights outside the window, moments ago twinkling and full of possibility, now seemed cold, distant, uncaring. My world had just imploded, soundlessly, in a cheap hotel room miles from home, while my husband laughed about leaving me destitute with his mistress. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before that night, life had a predictable rhythm. 10 years of marriage. A comfortable house in the suburbs. 2 incomes that, while not extravagant, afforded us a certain ease. He was in finance, something vaguely important with mergers and acquisitions. Long hours, business trips. I had a demanding job too, but less glamorous, more stable. We had talked about kids, about the future, about renovations. Normal things. The kind of things you build a life on. Looking back, the cracks were probably there, subtle shifts I'd dismissed as the natural settling of a long relationship. His increasing detachment. The way his eyes would glaze over when I talked about my day. The late nights that stretched later and later. The guardedness with his phone. I told myself it was stress from work. That men handle pressure differently. That marriage had phases. I made excuses because the alternative, the truth that was just delivered like a bomb through a misdialed phone call, was too terrifying to contemplate. My project, he'd sneered at, was more than just a hobby.
It was a piece of me.
An idea I'd had years ago, born from frustration in my own job. A platform, a service, something I believed could genuinely help people. I worked on it nights, weekends. He'd been dismissive from the start. "That's nice, honey. Busy little bee," he'd say, not looking up from his tablet. Or, "Don't spend too much on that, all right?" It's a long shot. He treated it like a cute, slightly annoying phase I was going through. Something that kept me occupied while he did whatever he did. He certainly never saw it as an asset. Never saw it as something that could grow into anything significant. In his world of high finance, my little startup was less than a rounding error. And his condescending dismissal, I now understood, wasn't just indifference. It was calculated. If it was worth nothing, he had nothing to worry about when he left. The silence on the line stretched, my own breathing shallow and ragged. He was still talking, whispering now, intimate nonsense that made me gag. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I stood there in the center of the room, the world spinning, the floor solid beneath my feet, but my sense of reality completely fractured. The man I had loved, the man I had built a life with, was a stranger, a predator, and he was planning to discard me, financially crippled. The next few days were a blur of motion and numbness. Flying home, the confrontation, his initial blustering denial, quickly dissolving when I told him exactly what I'd heard. His face, draining of color as he realized the phone call hadn't disconnected. There was no tearful confession, no apology for the affair. His only reaction, once the shock of being caught wore off, was anger. Anger that I knew. Anger that his careful plan had been compromised. He didn't even pretend remorse. The mask was off. He was exactly the man I'd overheard. The divorce proceedings started quickly. He had a lawyer ready, of course. Sharp, aggressive. My first lawyer was kinder, more empathetic, but seemed overwhelmed by his side's tactics. They were relentless, demanding every financial record, questioning every expense, trying to paint me as financially irresponsible, and always minimizing my contribution, my worth. His lawyer echoed his sentiment. My startup was a hobby, a drain on marital resources, certainly not an asset to be divided. They argued its value was zero, maybe even negative if you counted the time and money I'd put in. He was sticking to his promise to his mistress. I would get nothing. The house, most of the savings, the cars, everything was in his name, or structured in ways that his lawyer argued made them primarily his assets. I had my salary, which I had continued to earn, and the startup. My little paper dream. The early days of the divorce were a brutal education. About the law, about money, about the cold, hard reality of how relationships end when wealth is involved. And about the man I had married. He wasn't just leaving me, he was trying to erase me, to ensure I couldn't rebuild. It wasn't just about the money for him, I realized. It was about power.
Control.
Humiliation. He wanted to win, utterly and completely. And his mistress, I imagined, was cheering him on. Starting the startup for real, not just as a side project, became my lifeline, my anchor, my act of defiance. I quit my stable job, a move that horrified my first lawyer and delighted his. See, I imagine them saying, irresponsible, burning through assets, but I couldn't do both. I couldn't fight for my future in court and build that future with stolen hours. It had to be all or nothing. The startup became more than a business. It was my shield and my sword, my refuge from the emotional storm. Every line of code, every late-night strategy session, every rejection from an investor was a small battle in a much larger war. The stakes weren't just financial, they were existential. If the startup failed, he won. He was right. I would have nothing. The challenges piled up like sandbags during a flood. Funding was the first hurdle. Venture capitalists looked at me, a woman in the middle of a messy divorce, pivoting from a stable career to a tech startup, and saw risk with a capital R. Rejection emails piled up, each one a tiny echo of his dismissiveness. Interesting idea, but concerns about market traction. Team seems thin. Personal circumstances raise flags. Personal circumstances divorce. They didn't say it, but I knew. My savings dwindled. I moved out of the house, found a tiny, overpriced apartment. My office was my kitchen table. My team was initially just me, then a couple of freelancers I paid next to nothing, fueled by my unwavering belief and their own scrappy ambition. We worked around the clock, fueled by instant coffee and the raw fear of failure. Meanwhile, the divorce ground on. His lawyers continued their assault. They subpoenaed my bank records, my emails, even tried to get access to my startup's nascent internal documents, presumably to prove its worthlessness or find something, anything, to use against me. He seemed confident, smug. I would see him sometimes in court or during depositions. He avoided my eyes, but his posture, the slight smirk playing on his lips, spoke volumes. He was winning. He knew it. There was a particularly brutal mediation session. My new lawyer, sharper, more experienced, fought hard, but his side was immovable. They offered a pittance, barely enough to cover my legal fees, let alone provide a fresh start. Their position was simple. I had no significant assets, no earning potential outside of a standard job, which I'd foolishly quit, and the startup was a non-factor. His lawyer leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Miller, perhaps it's time to be realistic. Your husband is willing to be generous, considering the circumstances. But this fantasy of yours," he gestured vaguely, dismissively, towards my mention of the startup's future potential. "It has no bearing on the division of marital assets. It is speculative. And proven. Frankly, irrelevant." I looked at my husband sitting beside his lawyer.
He wasn't smirking this time.
He looked bored. Like this was a tedious transaction he was eager to conclude so he could move on to his real life. The one with the mistress. The one where I was a rapidly fading memory. That was the deepest point of the crisis. Sitting in that room, facing their combined certainty that I was defeated, hearing my life's work called a fantasy, I felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown me. My lawyer urged me to consider the offer. It wasn't fair, she admitted, but fighting further would cost more than I might ever recover, especially if the startup failed, which, she delicately implied, was a strong possibility. Outside the mediation room, the city noise seemed to mock me. I walked for hours, the concrete hard beneath my feet, my mind a whirlwind of failure and fear. He was winning. He was actually going to get away with it. Leave me with nothing, just as he promised. The thought was a physical pain in my chest. Then something shifted. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion, the emotional depletion leaving behind a hard, brittle core. Maybe it was the memory of his voice on the phone, the cold calculation in his words. She'll never get a penny. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't even just about fairness.
It was about agency.
About proving him, and everyone who doubted me, wrong. It was about refusing to be erased. In that moment, walking down a crowded street, the despair didn't vanish, but it was joined by a cold, fierce resolve. I couldn't control his actions, his betrayal, or the legal system's limitations. But I could control one thing: the fate of my startup. My future was not going to be decided by a judge or a lawyer or a cheating husband and his mistress. It was going to be decided by me, and by the value I created. I stopped focusing on the divorce as a battle to win money from him. I started seeing it as a battle to buy myself time and space to build my own money. My strategy shifted. Instead of fighting over every last marital asset, many of which were tied up or hidden anyway, I focused on protecting my startup and ending the divorce as quickly as possible, even if it meant accepting less than I deserved at that moment. It was a calculated risk, a gamble on my own ability to build something from the ground up. I told my lawyer my decision. She was hesitant. "You'd be giving up a lot," she warned. "Marital assets you're entitled to," I knew. But I also knew that prolonged legal warfare was bleeding me dry, emotionally, financially, and creatively. I needed to pour all my energy into the startup. It was my only way out. My real leverage wouldn't be found in court documents about our shared past. It would be built in the future, one line of code, one user, $1 of revenue at a time. We finalized the divorce settlement. It was exactly what he wanted. Minimal. Insulting, really. A fraction of the marital assets, no alimony, no recognition of the startup's potential value. He kept the house, most of the investments, the nice cars. I got my small apartment's worth of furniture, a modest cash payout that barely covered my remaining legal fees, and the startup, valued at zero for the purposes of the settlement. I signed the papers. My hand was steady. He was there, watching. He still had that air of quiet triumph. His lawyer shook my lawyer's hand, a polite, victorious smile on his face. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully cornered me, stripped me bare, left me with nothing but a dream they deemed worthless. They had no idea. Signing those papers was like shedding an old skin. The marriage, the betrayal, the crushing weight of it all, officially over. Now there was only the future and the startup. The next year was a blur of relentless work. The divorce was final, but the emotional scars were deep. The memory of his words, his laughter, fueled me, not with a desire for petty revenge, but with a burning need to prove my own worth to myself, to build something undeniable. We secured a small seed round of funding, enough to move out of my kitchen, hire a few more people, and iterate rapidly on the product. Every pitch, every demo, I carried the ghost of a sneer in my mind. Paper dreams worthless, I used it as fuel. The market responded, slowly at first, then faster. Users signed up. Revenue started trickling in, then flowing. We hit milestones that had seemed impossible just months before. Each small victory felt monumental. It wasn't just business success, it was personal vindication. He was oblivious, living his life, presumably with his mistress, secure in the knowledge that he had won. The divorce was over. I was gone, a non-entity. My startup was beneath his radar. He was playing in the big leagues of finance. My small company wasn't even on the same playing field. He never checked, never asked, never saw the quiet, relentless growth happening just out of his view. His arrogance, his absolute certainty that I was defeated, was his blind spot. My legal team, the one I now had on retainer for the startup, was sharp. They knew about the divorce, knew the history. As the startup grew, reaching significant valuation milestones in subsequent funding rounds, they helped me structure things, ensuring my equity was protected, my position strong. We talked about the future, about potential exits, even the possibility of an IPO, though that felt like a distant galaxy away at the time. But the growth accelerated. The market was hungry for what we offered. We landed major clients. Our user base exploded. Media started paying attention. Suddenly, my little project was being called an industry disruptor, a market leader. We raised a Series A, then a Series B round of funding, each at a valuation that would have made my ex-husband choke on his expensive coffee. My name started appearing in tech journals, in business news. Articles about the company, about me, the founder. I wondered if he saw them, if he recognized the name, if he put two and two together. Part of me wanted him to see, to know, to feel the cold dread of realizing his mistake. Another part of me just wanted to keep building, keep winning for myself. The opportunity for an IPO came sooner than anyone expected. The market was hot, our numbers were strong, the buzz was undeniable. The decision to go public was massive, terrifying, exhilarating. My legal and financial teams worked around the clock. There were prospectuses, roadshows, regulatory hurdles. It was all-consuming. And in the midst of it all, there was the valuation, the number that would determine everything. During this period, I hadn't spoken to my ex-husband since the divorce. Our paths were separate, or so I thought. He was still working in finance. His company was involved in M&A, tracking market movements, deals, IPOs. It was his world. My world had become the world he inhabited, but from a place he never expected me to reach. The day of the IPO, the air in the office was electric. We were all gathered, watching the market open. The initial price was set. The bell rang. The trading began. The number on the screen flickered, then started to climb. Steadily at first, then surging. The valuation of my company, the company he'd called worthless, the company valued at zero in our divorce settlement, was climbing into the billions. My personal stake, my equity that was protected, my shares that were now publicly traded assets, were suddenly worth more money than I could comprehend. More money than I had ever imagined. More money, I realized with a cold, hard jolt, than his entire net worth. The plot twist wasn't just that I got rich. It was that my wealth, derived from the thing he had dismissed and tried to devalue to leave me penniless, now dwarfed his own financial standing in the very world he prided himself on dominating. He hadn't just underestimated me, he had financially and strategically outmaneuvered himself through sheer arrogance. He'd fought tooth and nail to keep his assets, while dismissing the asset I was building, which turned out to be exponentially more valuable than anything he possessed. His boast, "She'll never get a penny," had become a cosmic punchline, a self-fulfilling prophecy of his own failure to see what was right in front of him. The moment I heard about his reaction wasn't directly from him, of course. It came through the grapevine, the whispering network of the finance world. My lawyer heard it first from someone on his side, someone who had been in the room. He was in a meeting, talking deals, doing whatever it is finance guys do. Someone mentioned the market, mentioned the day's big IPO,
Mention the company name.
my company. The conversation stalled. Someone checked the numbers,
Saw the surge.
saw the valuation, and someone, maybe inadvertently, mentioned my name. And he froze. Not just a pause. A complete physical stillness. His eyes went wide, fixed on a screen, or maybe just staring into the middle distance. The color drained from his face, just like it had that night in our living room when I confronted him with the phone call.
He couldn't speak.
Couldn't move. The man who had been so confident, so smug, so utterly certain of my financial destruction, was confronted with the undeniable reality that I hadn't just survived. I had built an empire from the ashes he thought he'd left me in. An empire that was now worth more than his kingdom. He sat there, frozen, in front of colleagues, in the world where status and wealth were everything, realizing that the woman he had discarded, the project he had mocked, was now objectively, undeniably, wealthier and more successful than him. The humiliation must have been complete.
Total.
He hadn't just failed to leave me penniless. He had, through his own actions and blindness, created the conditions for my unimaginable success and his own quiet defeat in the arena where he felt most powerful. I didn't gloat.
I didn't reach out.
There was no need. The universe, or perhaps just the brutal logic of the market combined with my relentless will, had delivered a kind of justice that no court could have provided. His boast had come back to haunt him, not in some abstract karmic way, but in the cold, hard numbers of the stock market. The aftermath of the IPO was a different kind of chaos. Media requests, investor calls, the demands of leading a public company. Life changed in radical ways. But amidst the whirlwind, there was a quiet center. The anger and the pain of the divorce, of his betrayal, had been transmuted. They weren't gone entirely, but they no longer held me captive. The victory wasn't in the money itself, though the financial security was a profound relief. The victory was in the building, in proving that I could stand on my own, that my dreams weren't paper dreams, that my worth wasn't determined by a man who couldn't see it. The victory was in taking his cruelty and turning it into the foundation of my own power. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think about that hotel room, the stale air, the sound of his voice, her laugh. She'll never get a penny. The words still echo, but now they sound hollow, ridiculous. A relic of a past life, spoken by a man who fundamentally misunderstood the woman he was trying to destroy. He thought money was the only currency. He didn't understand the value of resilience, of determination, of building something because you believe in it with every fiber of your being. He thought he was taking everything, but he left me the most important thing, the fire. The wealth is just a number. The real treasure is the unshakable knowledge that I built this. Every single penny of it. Not from him, but despite him. And he knows it. Frozen in his office, watching the numbers climb, he finally, fully understood. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.